Now, once we understand all the basic formalities of this balance of payments in terms of learning the names of the different components of this thing, as well as all the different international transactions and where exactly within this BOP they are recorded, once we know all those basics, we are now going to turn our attention towards these balances of the current account. And more specifically, we are now going to turn our entire focus towards studying the deficits of the current account. Now, these current account deficits, they are something that receive a lot of attention, in the sense that as soon as any country gets into a current account deficit, then that's very quickly, as you can see on the right over here, it's very quickly reported in a lot of newspapers and websites, and these deficits, they become the talking point of evening talk shows as well as casual discussions and chit chats. And the reason is that you see, these current account deficits, they don't necessarily have to be harmful for an economy, but if they start creating problems, then yes, there are a lot of things that can go wrong because of these current account deficits. The country can gradually sort of get sucked into a lot of different economic complications. And what we want over here is a detailed understanding of many different things about these current account deficits, including, first and foremost, the reasons or the causes of why countries get into these current account deficits. And once we know that, we will then try to build an understanding of all the possible complications and all the possible consequences of these current account deficits. And then we are going to finally close this section by looking at some of the policies that the government can use to correct and get rid of these current account deficits. So it is going to be all about these deficits of the current account for the remainder of the section. Now, as far as your exams are concerned, as far as your A-level economics is concerned, remember the causes and consequences. They are going to be the subject of your essay questions, whereas these policies to correct these current account deficits, they will be tested both in your MCQ as well as your essay questions. So that is always good to know before you start learning all these different things. Now, let me start off first of all by quickly reminding you of what we already know about the basic idea, the basic concept of what is a current account deficit, and we will take things on from there. So what we have already learned is that a current account deficit, it simply means that overall there is a larger amount of outflow of dollars than inflows because of all of these different international transactions that are recorded within the country's current account. And therefore, if you add all of these outflows with inflows of the current account, the overall answer, the balance that you will get, will be a negative number, and that is where we say that the current account is in a deficit. This negative, this minus sign reflecting that net there is an overall outflow of dollars from the current account. Now that is what we already know. Now, the way economists explain what this current account deficit means for a country, or what it tells us about a country, economists have a very, very interesting way of explaining that, and a very sort of a to-the-point way in which they explain what this current account deficit actually tells us about a country. And what economists say is that, you see, whenever a country gets into a current account deficit, that simply reflects that that country is overspending and that country is living beyond its means. So very, very interesting explanation, but let me explain what this in turn means. What does it mean to say that the current account deficit is reflecting the country's living beyond means? Now, to understand that, you see, you just need to look at this current account and remind yourselves that, look, it's composed of 3 different subsections. So as far as the inflows of dollars within the current account are concerned, there can be 3 different sources. Either you receive inflows in the current transfers or the incomes part, or you receive inflows within your trade part because of the goods and services you export or sell to other countries. Now, out of all of these three different sources of dollar inflows, remember that it is always the dollar inflows because of the exports that you sell to other countries, which is the main source of dollar earnings. Meaning that maybe a country receives some income inflows, some current transfer inflows, but basically most of the dollar inflows, they are accounted for by your export earnings. On the other hand, as far as these dollar outflows from the current account are concerned, again, theoretically, there can be three reasons for that, because dollars can flow out from either of these three subsections of the current account. But again, the main reason why dollars flow out of the country, the main source of these dollar outflows, is your imports of goods and services. The dollar payments you have to make for the things that you buy from other countries, that you import from other countries throughout the year, that is the main source of dollar outflow from your current account. Now, once you understand that, you see the simple issue, the simple problem with countries that get into these current account deficits is that they don't export enough goods, and therefore they have very small amount of dollar inflows, a small amount of, we say, export earnings, and relative to that, they import too much. And therefore, there is a huge import bill every year that that country has to pay. There is a large amount of dollars that flow out in the form of payments for all of these imports and for all these things that you are buying from other countries. And that basically, first of all, it throws your trade part into a deficit, and ultimately that throws the whole current account into a deficit as well. So just to make this illustration complete, let us assume there is a small amount of net inflow in incomes part, a small amount of net inflow in current transfers part, which is not always the case. There can be net outflows over here worsening this situation of overspending on imports, but let's just assume there is some inflow of incomes, some inflow of current transfers, but a current account deficit. This is how you would think about it, that your total dollar incomes or total dollar inflows because of your exports as well as current transfers and incomes, when they are less than the amount of dollars that you spend on imports, then this excess outflow of dollars, this excess spending on imports, this is what is known as your current account deficit. This is what shows up here as a negative value. And this overspending on imports, this extra outflow of dollars on these imports relative to the dollars you are earning, this is what makes economists conclude that, look, this current account deficit is just telling you you're overspending dollars, you're buying more imports from other countries than what you can afford. You are living beyond your means. That's what a current account deficit reflects. So that's the first thing, and that's a very, very useful start, a very good way of, thinking about a current account deficit before we go into all of the detail of, okay, what are the root causes of these current account deficits and what are their consequences and so on and so forth. Now, it is also quite simple to see once you understand a current account deficit as telling you that the country is living beyond means, then you see it becomes pretty clear to see that why these current account deficits can potentially be problematic. You are not selling things to other countries, you keep on buying from them, you are spending more dollars than what you are earning. So if you keep on doing this, if you keep on getting into these current account deficits, then of course you will potentially get into problems. Now it is very, very interesting to study all of that, the possible consequences, the possible complications that these current account deficits can create, and when they are actually not harmful at all. But we will look at those details in the next video. Before that, what I want to do now in the second half of this video is that I want to explain a few reasons why countries live beyond their means and why countries have this tendency to over-import and why are they unable to export enough goods. Because you see, the A-level examiner, he will ask you to analyze the causes of current account deficit, to analyze the reasons why countries get into these current account deficits. So you just can't simply say that, look, they import too much and they export too few goods, therefore they get into a current account deficit. That is not an analysis. Analysis would require you to actually explain the reasons why the country has this tendency to import too much, and on the other hand, why is it unable to export that many goods. So there are a lot of reasons for that, but let me just give you 4 or 5 of them. And again, I will explain things from the point of view of a country like Pakistan, your typical agricultural developing economy. Now, the first reason why these countries get into these current account deficits is simply that these countries, they don't produce enough goods. These are agricultural economies, so majority of their output are agricultural goods, such as fruits and vegetables and other crops such as rice and wheat and corn and so on and so forth. So they don't make manufactured goods such as cars and laptops and fridges and freezers and so on and so forth. And when your country, when it doesn't make enough goods, then that creates 2 problems. First of all, you won't have enough things to sell, so you won't be able to export enough things. You're not making enough goods. And secondly, people of your country, so people living in Pakistan, they will, when they find that nothing is available, nothing is being made in their home country, then they will take advantage of international trade and they will buy all of these things from other countries. They will start importing all the things that any modern economy uses. So that would mean that your country will end up importing too much and exporting too little. It will end up living beyond means. It will end up in a current account deficit because it does not make enough goods. So that's the first simple reason. Now, the second reason why these countries get into a current account deficit is, as I said, they are agricultural economies. Majority of their output are agricultural goods, and therefore whatever they export, majority of their exports are also agricultural goods. And the problem with agricultural exports is that they are considered to be low value goods, these crops and fruits and vegetables. Low value in the sense that they don't attract a very good price. So compare, let's say, one Apple's iPhone. You sell one iPhone, you earn $1,500. But to earn $1,500 by selling wheat or rice, you will have to sell tons of rice because they are lowly valued goods. They don't attract prices of $15,000 per unit. So the problem for countries like Pakistan, where the only thing they have to, the main thing they have to export are these agricultural goods with low prices, their main problem is that if they want to improve their export earnings, they have to increase the quantity of their exports a lot. Only then will they be able to get any significant increase in export earnings, because you see, the product you are selling, it is of very low, small price. They are cheap products. So it becomes really difficult for you to generate export earnings or to increase export earnings. And that is where you end up living beyond your means and in a current account deficit. Then the next reason why countries like Pakistan get into these current account deficits is the problem of inflation. Countries like Pakistan, struggling economies, they usually have this huge problem of inflation where they can't keep a check on the price levels. Prices keep on increasing. And what it means for your current account, you see, if there is a lot of inflation in Pakistan and things become more expensive, then your exports will become expensive and therefore export quantity will fall. Now, if the demand for your exports is elastic, that is, if foreigners, they start buying much lesser exports as they become expensive, then the export earnings will also fall and your country will get into a current account deficit because of inflation. Now, this inflation will also impact your import prices and therefore import quantity and import spending. And the way that works is that, you see, if you have inflation in Pakistan, and something is becoming more and more and more expensive in Pakistan, then relatively you can say that that same thing is becoming relatively cheaper in China, because maybe there is no inflation in China and your country's product is becoming more and more and more expensive. So if there is inflation, your imports, they become relatively cheaper it becomes cheaper to buy that thing from some other country. So your import quantity will increase. Again, if your import demand is elastic, you will start buying a lot more imports, and therefore the total import spending will increase. Your country will go into a current account deficit. Now, the simple idea here, remember, is inflation means your thing is expensive, so exports are expensive, fewer will be bought, and your people will start buying from other countries. But remember, this link of elasticity in all of this explanation is important, because the A-level exam will sometimes ask you, will inflation always cause a current account deficit? So it should. The simple logic, exports are expensive, less will be bought, imports are cheaper, more will be bought. But will it always cause a current account deficit? Well, you need the export and import demand to be elastic for that to happen. And secondly, remember, we want the rate of inflation in Pakistan to be more than the rate of inflation in the other countries. Only then will inflation create problems. Only then will inflation make your products relatively more expensive. So don't just say inflation will always cause current account deficit. If the inflation in your country is relatively more than the inflation in other countries, and if the import-export demand is elastic, then yes, inflation will cause a current account deficit. So that was a little bit of detail. It is important. This is something that will be asked specifically. But let me now move on much more quickly through a couple of more reasons for why countries get into current account deficit. Now, the next reason is a very interesting one and a very easy one to explain in your essay questions. This is where economists say that sometimes the reasons why countries get into these current account deficits is simply because of this foreign is better mentality. Now, let me explain that through an example. You see, if I put two exactly similar looking mobile phones in front of you, and the only thing that I tell you about these mobile phones is that, you see, one is made in Pakistan and the other one is made in Norway, then most likely you are going to pick the one made in Norway, assuming that, look, it must be better than the one made in Pakistan, right? Now, that is what we mean by foreign is better mentality. And if your country's people have that mentality, then they will unnecessarily end up buying or importing those things from other countries that are maybe being produced in your country and that are maybe equally good quality. But just because of this foreign is better mentality, you will unnecessarily end up importing even those things, and therefore that would add up to your huge import bills and throw your country's current account into a deficit. Now, I'll give you one more reason why countries go into a current account deficit. But before that, let me just tell you that these first four reasons that I've just explained, they are sometimes known as structural causes of current account deficit, meaning that they reflect a structural, deep-rooted, entrenched, long-term issue with the economy because of which the country ends up importing too much and exporting too little. These are structural, long-term issues that are creating these problems. Now, as opposed to these structural issues, these are really the ones that create problems. Let me just end up by giving you one cyclical cause of a current account deficit. Cyclical meaning a temporary reason why sometimes current accounts may go into deficit and then self-correct themselves. And the cyclical cause that I want you to know is economic growth. Because you see, economic growth means that a country's GDP and employment and incomes, they are increasing. And generally people are getting better off. And when that happens, and the people of that country that is experiencing economic growth, they will start buying more things, both made in their own country and things made in other countries. So they will start importing more. And that will throw the current account into a deficit. Not necessarily, but that may throw the current account into a deficit. But the reason we say this is a cyclical cause is that, you see, the economy of any country, it moves in cycles. It moves in cycles of recession and economic growth and so on and so forth. So if your country is experiencing economic growth and therefore it is overspending on imports, well, soon it will experience recession, it will go into a downturn, and GDP, employment, income will fall, and you will stop buying these excess imports and your current account deficits will resolve themselves. So that is where we say that, look, this is a cyclical cause. This is a sort of current account deficit that will appear with an up cycle of the economy, and it will as quickly disappear with the down cycle of the economy. So when we talk about problematic current account deficits, remember, those are the current account deficits caused because of these structural issues, not these cyclical current account deficits. So with that, let me just close this video over here, and now we'll talk about the possible consequences of these current account deficits, the possible consequences for a country when it lives beyond its means and overspends on imports. That is coming up in the next video.